tying the fly, we're going to talk a little bit about what it is we're tying. We're going to be tying a Caddis Pupa in two different vulnerable points in the Caddis Pupa's emergence. You will remember that caddis have a complete metamorphosis. That is, they go from egg to larva to pupa to adult through those stages. We're going to be tying the pupa, and we're going to be tying it in the Gary LaFontaine style. Gary LaFontaine ties emergent and deep sparkle Caddis Pupa using a sparkly material. Caddis Pupa, when they emerge from the worm itself, the larva, spend some initial time before they rise to the surface simply on the bottom of either the lake or the stream. If it's a stream, they're bouncing along down the stream on the bottom while they gather and generate the gases necessary to buoy them to the surface. And what happens is that when they take those gases in, this sheath that they've emerged from the pupal shuck in, from this cocoon in, this sheath is still around them. And the gases are between their perfectly formed adult body and this sheath. And it gives off a kind of refraction of the light that, according to Gary LaFontaine, is one of the triggers that trout fix on. Gary LaFontaine died about a decade ago, succumbed unfortunately to Lou Gehrig's disease. He had a degree in behavioral psychology and managed to convince his mentors that his subject matter should be the feeding behavior of trout for his thesis in behavioral psychology. So he spent 10 years in scuba gear in a stream watching caddis emerge. And these two patterns that we're going to quickly show are the results of his research. This Caddis Pupa bounces along the bottom while it gathers these gases and generates these gases before it's buoyed to the surface. It may be in a stream, depending on the speed of the flow, it may be 20, 30, 40 feet that it will go along the bottom. When it does that, we will imitate that with a pattern known as the deep sparkle pupa. It then rises to the surface. While it's rising to the surface, trout will chase it as it rises to the surface. And when it hits the surface, trout will often leave the surface of the water chasing emerging Caddis Pupa. While that Caddis Pupa is in its emergent stage, it will float under the surface film, just in it, but just under it. If you sit and stare at a stream and you see rainbow trout coming up, but you can't see anything on the surface that they're taking, chances are very good that they're taking Caddis Pupa, emergent Caddis Pupa, that are hanging just under the film and floating for some distance underneath. Once a caddis emerges, it leaves the water quickly.
And when you say emerge, from water into the air?
From water to air.
Not out of that sheath?
Right. They come out of the sheath.
Okay.
The sheath splits open down the back.
Okay.
And the caddis climbs out of it by first pushing the wing parts out, then climbing out of it on top of the water, and then flies off. And it takes about that length of time once it breaks through the sheath. But while it's still sitting in this surface film, it's very vulnerable to trout. And that's the first pattern we're going to tie, is that one. Talk for just a second here about how you fish these two patterns. The deep pattern is fished along the bottom, primarily, and allowed to rise up. The emergent pattern is fished in the surface film and is fished as if it were a dry fly. Fish both of them on a dry line. Don't put fly floatant on either of them. Allow the emergent pattern to sit just below the surface film. If it starts to sink too much, grease your leader. Grease your tippet down to within a foot or so of your fly so that it will just break through the surface film and sit there, and just in underneath the surface film. And that's where you'll fish this emergent pattern. For the deep pattern, I use a bead head on mine, and I fish it with a lysing, what's called the lysing ring lift. The lysing ring lift is a technique for fishing nymphs or Caddis Pupa, and consists of casting the fly at least quartering upstream, preferably a little bit more than quartering upstream. And as the fly approaches you, you lift the rod tip up. You're fishing with a floating line and a length of leader that will allow that your fly can be on the bottom, but that your fly line will not be on the water. You want to keep as much of your fly line off the water as you can, and you lift the rod tip as the fly goes by you to keep it off the bottom. As it passes you, lower the rod tip back down again, and then stop the rod and give it just a twitch. And when you give it just that twitch, it will lift the fly off the bottom, and the fly will begin its ascent on your tight line. And it will come up, hopefully, if you've placed your fly where you should be, near the bottom of the riffle, it will come up in the face of the trout for the take. That's called the lysing ring lift, and is how you fish the deep sparkle pupa. This whole concept of triggers that we've talked about a few times before was really pioneered by Gary LaFontaine, who developed these two patterns, who felt that there is one primary trigger, probably. There may be any number of secondary triggers that the fish key in on. That these triggers are what cause the trout to strike. And that they are what is of consequence in your pattern. And it really doesn't matter too much about a whole lot of the rest of it. As long as you've got size, if you're paying attention to size, you're paying attention to color, you're paying attention to giving it some sort of behavior. But you're focusing on the triggers. The trigger in the emergent pattern is believed to be, the primary trigger is believed to be these bubbles of air. And we're going to represent those bubbles of air by tying with antron. And we're going to tie an antron sheath. Antron was a product that was also discovered by Gary LaFontaine, made by DuPont originally, and comes from rugs. And the beauty of antron, as opposed to what people will try and sell you as antron, which is just a polypropylene, is that antron is three-sided. You may not see it when you look at it, but antron is three-sided, and it reflects light in a particular manner. So when you tie this bubble sheath that we're going to tie with antron, on a sunny day at emergence, it will reflect light and look like this bubble. When you look through it, I tied up one of each here last night to show. This is one of my emergent patterns here. And this emergent pattern, if you hold your emergent pattern up to the light, you'll see a body through the sheath. So we can just pass that around. This one, on a deep sparkle pupa, LaFontaine was of the view that on the deep sparkle pupa, in addition to the sheath, where the secondary trigger on the emergent is the wing pad, the secondary trigger on the deep is actually the legs and antenna. So we tie the legs and the antenna out of partridge. If we don't have partridge, we can use grouse. Do we have grouse or partridge? We can use some. We have some kind of brown hackle of some kind. Partridge and grouse work good. You can use guinea fowl if you need to, but it needs to be a relatively soft one, that when you tie it, you tie a single wrap, or two at the most, to represent antenna and legs. I tie my weighted flies with a bead. That's generally about all I tie. Same idea though, hold it up to the light and you can see the body through the sheath. There goes another one around, and then we'll start tying.